Welcome back to the Universalis podcast. I am Martin Kochański, the creator of Universalis, and in this episode I'll be looking at the highlights of the week ahead, starting with Sunday the 13th of July. This Monday is the day when Frenchmen everywhere celebrate the birth of liberty through massacre. The French Revolution may have been necessary for France, but it has also given benefits to the world and the whole Church across the world by giving us new martyrs to celebrate. This Thursday, the 17th, is the day when the Carmelites celebrate their nun, Blessed Thérèse of St. Augustine, and her companions. At Compiègne in northern France there was a Carmelite convent with some 20 sisters. They lived enclosed lives of contemplation and prayer, and prayed in particular for all the needs of the people of the region. Sister Thérèse was elected prioress of the convent in 1786 at the age of 34. In 1789 the French Revolution came to bring liberty to everybody, not least to poor helpless women who had been shut up in convents for life. In August 1790 a commission arrived to interrogate the nuns of Compiègne one by one as to whether they were being held against their will. They all said that they were not, and many said that their one wish was to live and die as Carmelite nuns. This was the wrong answer. One lesson we have learnt about liberators throughout history is that they want you to be free to do anything you want, as long as you want what they want you to want. In this case, you are free not to be a nun, morphed effortlessly into you are not free to be a nun. In September 1792 the convent was closed and the nuns were dispersed. Now there was no longer a convent. However, in a rented apartment in the town there happened to be a group of 4 women who lived together. There was another apartment not far away which held another 4 women, and another, and another. By some coincidence all those women somehow happened to spend much of their time in private, in prayer and contemplation. Sister Thérèse proposed that among their daily prayers there should be an act of consecration of themselves, in which each of the nuns would offer herself entirely to God as a holocaust for the restoration of peace to France and to the Church. After some months of discussion and deep thought, all the nuns committed themselves to this. In the wider world there remained the grave threat that these nuns posed to the revolution. Liberty cannot work if it means that people just do whatever they want. So the nuns were arrested, locked up against their will in a monastery, then transported to Paris to be, in that order, convicted, then tried, then executed. They spent the 16th of July, the feast of Our Lady of Mount Carmel, in prison. The next day, in the courtroom of freedom, the Revolutionary Tribunal condemned them to death, or so it thought. In reality, it condemned them to victory. As far as I know, the Church has never gone so far as to design a liturgy for the act of martyrdom. What Sister Thérèse and her 15 companions did was this. As they were being taken from the prison to the guillotine, they sang Vespers, Compline, and the Office of the Dead. When they arrived at the square where the guillotine was set up, they sang first the Te Deum and then the Veni Creator Spiritus. The sympathetic executioner allowed the nuns to finish all this and allowed Sister Thérèse, their prioress, to decide the order of martyrdom. One young novice, who had until then been unable to make her monastic profession because of the anti-religious laws, now pronounced her vows before the rest of the community. She knelt to receive Sister Thérèse's blessing and asked her permission to die, which was granted. One by one the rest of the community followed. Each of them kissed a tiny terracotta statue of the Madonna and Child, which the prioress held out to her. When Sister Thérèse's own turn came, a woman in the crowd reached up to take custody of the statue, and it is now in the restored Carmel at Compiègne. That was the nuns' martyrdom. Their victory came sooner than anyone might have expected. 11 days after the Carmelite sisters' martyrdom, the creator and master of the Reign of Terror, Maximilien Robespierre, was executed in front of a crowd screaming with joy. The Carmelites are a big mystery among the religious orders. nobody founded them as far as one can tell. In the 12th century, some hermits were found to be on Mount Carmel as if they had always been on Mount Carmel. There were signs of their already having been around in the time of the prophet Elijah, and all the Carmelites honour him as their father. In the 1230s, the position of the Christians in the Holy Land became precarious. The hermits emigrated to Cyprus, Sicily, France, and England. Wherever they went, they were welcomed for the special kind of holiness they carried. What was that holiness? How was it to be expressed when one was not up on a bleak mountain in the middle of the Holy Land? It wasn't easy to work it out, but when the dust had settled, the Carmelites were a contemplative order, wedded to poverty and devoted to prayer. And indeed, the key contribution of the Carmelites to the universal church has been their mastery of contemplative prayer. I shan't say anything more about the Carmelites now, because I talked an awful lot about them in this podcast last year. So this is a good opportunity for me to remind you that all the back episodes of the podcast are still available for you to listen to. I don't know how long Spotify and Apple Podcasts keep back numbers, but you can find everything on our website. Simply go to universalis.com, and near the top on the right-hand side you will find a button marked podcast. A friend of mine says that when he starts listening to a podcast, he likes to go all the way back to the beginning of the series to get to know it properly. If you are like him, don't do it all at once, because by now there are more than 70 back episodes to listen to. The Universalis apps and programs have illustrations on the About Today page. Sometimes the illustration is a portrait of the saint or even a photograph, or a painting or sculpture featuring him, or a church or a monument or a shrine. But if you look at About Today on Thursday the 17th, you will see an illustration which seems to be none of those things. For one thing, it is far too blue. It looks like an underwater scene. And so it is. Here is its story. The saint in question is Blessed Ignacio de Azevedo with his companions. His feast is celebrated only in Brazil, but the way Universalis works, the About Today page lists saints who are celebrated anywhere in the world on that day, not just the ones who are celebrated wherever you happen to be. The early history of colonization in Brazil is similar to the rest of the New World. The rulers of the Old World, in this case the King of Portugal, knew exactly how it ought to be done, combining evangelization with respect for the rights and indeed the lives of the inhabitants. High principles were espoused. High-minded orders were issued. But somehow 1,000 miles of salt water washed all this away, and out there in the Western Hemisphere people stole, murdered, enslaved, and kept concubines, behaving much the same whether they were royal officials, or priests, or just the latest boatload of adventurers. The Jesuits' mission in Brazil was intended to set these things right, and in particular to protect the Indians by evangelizing them, preventing them from being enslaved, and collecting them together to live in towns of their own where they had a chance of defending themselves against marauders. Ignacio de Azevedo was a senior Portuguese Jesuit who in 1565 was sent by St. Francis Borgia to visit and inspect the Portuguese colony of Brazil. In 1568 he came back and went to Rome to make his final report, and then asked to be sent back to Brazil as a missionary. Given the situation I have described, you would not be surprised to hear that Azevedo and his party were slaughtered by the settlers and slavers whose comfortable existence they were trying to impede. But these people didn't even get a chance to attack them. As the ship on which Azevedo and 39 of his companions were travelling passed Las Palmas in the Canary Islands, it was attacked by 5 shiploads of French Protestant corsairs. After an exchange of fire, the ship surrendered, the crew were allowed to go free, and all 40 missionaries were killed and their bodies thrown overboard. This is very much business as usual where martyrdom is concerned, and you can see why Azevedo and his companions are only celebrated in the Brazilian calendar, where they have a local connection. But more recently their legacy has surfaced in an unexpected way, although surfaced isn't really the word, as you'll see, and that is where this mysterious blue picture comes in. In 1999, in the sea off Las Palmas in the Canary Islands, where the attack and massacre had taken place, 40 commemorative stone crosses were lowered to the sea bed as a monument to commemorate the martyrs. The crosses stand at a depth of 10 fathoms, or 60 feet, or 20 metres, if you prefer. They are a popular destination for scuba divers. In the quarter of a century since they were set up, they have been partly encrusted with sea life. Probably they will need to be tidied up from time to time, but if ever people forget, then still, in some distant age, this field of crosses may be rediscovered, and the people of that time will learn something about us which they might not have learnt from any other source. And meanwhile, when we think about scuba divers going down to these crosses because we think they are an interesting destination and make a change from shipwrecks, well, let's think about it like that if we want, but the instinct to venerate places, and especially places associated with people, is a universal one, far deeper than any religion. Perhaps some of the divers don't give a thought to it, but perhaps a little of what this is all about does stick. When we hear the parable of the sower, which we're going to hear at Mass fairly soon, we think about the seed because Jesus talks about the seed. But the parable of the sower presupposes the existence of the soil for the seed to be sown in, and anything we can do to add grains of compost to that soil, we should, even if it is sinking 40 massive crosses onto the bed of the sea for people to swim to. We are having quite a few religious orders just now. We had the Benedictines last week and the Carmelites this week, but also this week is the Franciscan theologian St. Bonaventure on Tuesday the 15th. The early history of the Franciscan order might be described without too much parody as trying to discard enough of St. Francis's principles to make an order that would work and survive, but not to discard so many that the Franciscans would end up being an order just like all the other orders. We hear about this most often in connection with property. St. Francis wanted the Franciscans to own nothing at all, to emulate the evangelical poverty of Christ, to have no possessions so that they could come close to the poor and destitute who have no possessions. A moment's reflection will show that this is not practicable. Suppose a church is needed, and you go round begging a stone here, some mortar there, and you beg some unwanted land off someone and you build it. Who owns it? Who has control? Because if someone else owns it, someone else has control over it. If he or a descendant of his changes his mind about that church, or wants that unwanted land, then out go the Franciscans, and the poor are abandoned. The key to preventing this is, of course, ownership. But whoever possesses anything, even if it is a possession destined for the use of others, like a church or something, is possessed by it. He ends up having to defend it one way or another. Sooner or later, lawyers will get involved. You can see where it all goes. That was one insoluble problem the early Franciscans had to solve, but it was not the only one. There was a parallel problem. They were there to come close to the poor, even to the point of wearing ragged clothes, even to the point of eating mouldy bread. Did this also mean that they had to be as ignorant as the poor? Because learning, scholarship, these all imply distance and also in some sense superiority. Ought they even to be Franciscan priests? Yes and no. No, because a cleric is different from a layman, and a difference means a distance. Yes, because otherwise they would have to get their priests from somewhere else, and again there are questions of power and control. By the time St. Bonaventure became a Franciscan, this question had been largely settled. There had to be Franciscan priests. Those priests had to be trained and educated, so there needed to be Franciscan teachers, both to teach the priests and to teach the next generation of teachers. Bonaventure became a Franciscan in 1243. He studied philosophy and theology at the University of Paris, and he became a famous teacher and philosopher. He was elected general of the Franciscan order in 1255. He managed to persuade the Pope not to make him Archbishop of York in 1265, but couldn't avoid being made a cardinal 8 years later. In 1274 he played an important part as a theologian in the Council of Lyons, which was called to reunite and reconcile the Greek and Latin churches. He died suddenly at the council under suspicious circumstances. Bonaventure wrote extensively on philosophy and theology, integrating faith with reason. He made a permanent mark on intellectual history, but he always insisted that the simple and uneducated could have a clearer knowledge of God than the wise. We all need to strike a balance between theory and direct knowledge. On the one hand, I can't live my life wholly and exclusively on the basis of what I have been told by my teachers. On the other hand, I can't rely purely on what I happen to have experienced in my life without reflection, some understanding, even some guidance. At this point, I was going to say quite a lot about the Creed in slow motion, but in the end there just isn't enough time. Let me summarise the spirit of the book, at least, by telling you that it doesn't tell you what to think, as if you had to memorise it all. It tells you to think, and it shows you some of the exciting things you might find yourself thinking if you tried that exercise for yourself. Talking about trying the exercise, I have done just that this week. I have followed last week's recommendation. I have been walking round the park with my earphones in, pressing the play button and listening to just the first and second readings in the Office of Readings for each day in the coming week. It turns out to be rather an exciting experience. This week we get all the big stories from the Book of Kings about Elijah and Elisha. For one thing, we get Elijah and the priests of Baal on Mount Carmel, which can't possibly be a coincidence given the Carmelite feast this week. The great thing about listening rather than reading, I've said it before, is that you can't skim. If it feels long, you can't let your eyes slide over it to the end, because ears don't slide. For me, this coming week, this particular year, that made me listen more closely, and something has struck a chord in the story of Naboth's vineyard. We think of vineyards, land, houses, as just property, a thing you own, a thing you buy or sell. So it is tempting to imagine ourselves in this story telling Naboth, "Don't be so obstinate. If the king wants your vineyard and is offering a silly price for it, more fool he. Take the money and buy yourself a great estate somewhere else with it." Naboth doesn't do it. He doesn't even think of doing it. And perhaps Naboth may be right. We are incarnate beings. That means, as we know, that we don't have bodies. Our body is not something we have, but something we are. I am not a soul inhabiting a body, or even a soul temporarily possessing a body. I am body and I am soul, both at once. Now, a body is a physical object. That means that it is in one place rather than another. That means that a body has a close connection to other physical objects close to it in time and space. It has a connection to place. This means that my vineyard is more than just a piece of paper which by a signature can go from one person to another, no harm done. My vineyard is not my property, just as my body is not my property. To some extent, the theologians will sort me out on this, I'm sure, my vineyard is me, and Naboth was right. The other big thing about walking round the park with the Office of Readings is that this week is the week when we hear St. Ambrose addressing very new Christians in 5th century Milan, explaining to them exactly what happened to them at their baptism and First Communion. As he says, they haven't been told all that much in advance. Better to experience it first and then think over it and understand in detail what it all means. Ambrose connects it all with Scripture, both the Old Testament and the New. He brings in echoes from the creation, from Noah's Ark and the dove, from the crossing of the Red Sea, to show how baptism echoes it all and sums it all up. The anointing with oil after baptism, the white garments of the newly baptized, these all have their spiritual connections as well. It is all aimed at beginning Christians, but it is always worth reading something aimed at beginners, because there is always something one has forgotten, just as a painted wall can always do with one more coat of paint. That's all for this week. If you'd like to write to us about anything, send an email to universalis@universalis.com. We look forward to hearing from you. Have a good week in every sense, and let's pray for one another.